You about the stakes in this election as plainly as I can. If we're going to get this virus under control, get folks back to work, and make sure affordable health care is available for everybody, we've got to send people to Washington who aren't interested in playing political games or making themselves rich. We've got to elect folks who will get to work for people like you. That's why I'm supporting Reverend Raphael Warnock in the special election for Senate. Reverend Warnock's someone I've known for years. He's a man of great moral integrity, a leader in the truest sense of the word. He's spent his life pushing for justice, fighting to expand health care, protecting voting rights and the dignity of work. You don't find a lot of people in Washington like Reverend Warnock, and that's exactly why we got to get him there. Please join me in supporting Raphael Warnock for Senate.
I'm Raphael Warnock, and I know we can do better. That's why I approve this message.
Georgia, I know things are tough right now, but I want you to know help is on the way. My administration is preparing to beat COVID-19 and get economic relief to the American people. On day one as your president, I'm prepared to sign a COVID relief package that fully funds the public health response needed, led by Georgia's own CDC. It will ensure free testing and vaccination for every American, and will get small businesses the assistance they need right now. Let me be clear, I need Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff in the United States Senate to get this done. There are folks in Congress threatening to do everything in their power to block our efforts. We need you to get out there and vote for Jon Ossoff as well as Raphael Warnock. We need them in the Senate. God bless America and may God protect our troops.
I'm Raphael Warnock.
And I'm Jon Ossoff.
And we approve this message.
I'm Jon Ossoff. Truth is, corruption in Washington has infected both parties. They're too busy serving lobbyists to serve us. I'll ban corporate political donations and secret corporate money in politics. And I'll crack down on price gouging by health insurance and drug companies who use that money to buy off Congress. We're all in this together. Together we can end the corruption and make health care affordable. Fighting corruption is my job, and that's why I approve this message.
Campaign for the United States Senate as a logical next step to the work I've been doing all along. I've been fighting for healthcare reform, saying it really is a moral mandate. I've been fighting for the dignity of work. I've been fighting for children to have access to quality education. I see this as a path to doing good work. And I'd be deeply honored if the people of Georgia would give me that privilege. I'm Raphael Warnock, and I approve this message.
Hey, it's Jon Ossoff, from home. My wife Alicia is a doctor at the hospital. She tested positive for COVID, so we're quarantined. I'm so grateful she's getting better. But too many Americans are still getting sick. We need to listen to medical experts, coordinate a national testing strategy, and stop politicizing masks. I approve this message because nurses and doctors like Alicia, they're doing their jobs. It's way past time politicians did theirs.
Raphael Warnock eats pizza with a fork and knife. Raphael Warnock once stepped on a crack in the sidewalk. Raphael Warnock even hates puppies.
Get ready, Georgia. The negative ads are coming. Kelly Loeffler doesn't want to talk about why she's for getting rid of health care in the middle of a pandemic, so she's going to try and scare you with lies about me. I'm Raphael Warnock, and I approve this message because I'm staying focused on what Washington could do for you. And by the way, I love puppies.
I'm Jon Ossoff, and the path to recovery is clear. First, we listen to medical experts to control this virus. Then we shore up our economy with stronger support for small businesses and tax relief for working families. And it's time for a historic infrastructure plan to get people back to work and invest in our future. We need leaders who bring us together to get this done. And that's why I approve this message. Is grateful for the doctors, nurses, first responders, for those who sacrifice to keep the lights on, to keep us fed, to keep us safe, to keep us moving, for the teachers who have gone above and beyond, for the love and support of our families. Everybody in Georgia is thankful for everyone who stepped up to get us through this year. And now it's time to step up for them, to reunite our country and end this crisis. I'll work with Joe Biden to beat the virus, empowering medical experts to implement a national health strategy with free testing and vaccinations, to provide immediate financial relief for working families and small businesses, and an infrastructure and jobs program that will jumpstart our economy. And when we get this done, next year it's Thanksgiving with the whole family. To all who have given so much this year, thank you. I'm John Ossoff, and I approve this message.
What does Thanksgiving mean in the year 2020? That's a very good question. We've seen challenges and strife this year, the likes of which we never could have imagined. Many have lost livelihoods. Others have lost loved ones. These are difficult and dark days. And yet the scripture says that the light shines through the darkness, and the darkness overcometh it not. And so we will get through this, and we will get through it all together, expressing our gratitude even in the midst of grief. And so for now, we pause to say thank you. Thanks to those who bravely serve our country. Thanks to the teachers, the doctors and nurses, the essential workers. And to those who've lost loved ones in recent days and for whom the holiday seasons are particularly difficult, I pray for your strength. I'm Raphael Warnock, and I approve this message.
I'm John Ossoff, and I approve this message.
When this pandemic hit, millions of Georgians like me had to file for unemployment. We needed our senator's help. But for David Perdue, we weren't the priority. Senator Perdue voted to give hundreds of billions to big corporations, even if they lay people off. But he fought against the $1,200 stimulus check for workers and supported cutting our unemployment benefits. Even at a moment like this, David Perdue's there for his donors, but not for us.
Your neighbor as yourself. It's a value we all try to live by, but in Washington, it's been forgotten. It's clear, our politics are broken, overcome by a selfishness that rewards money and power, leaving far too many of us out of the conversation. I'm Raphael Warnock, and I see you. I see too many communities left behind, too many hard-working people ignored. I'm running for Senate to be your voice. That's why I approve this message.
Daring to demand the right to vote for Black Americans. In Selma, Alabama, 55 years ago, John Lewis was nearly killed as he and hundreds marched across this bridge. That movement's courage secured the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but the promise of equal justice in America remains unfulfilled. So together we'll fight for a new Civil Rights Act and a new Voting Rights Act to ensure equal justice for all, no matter the color of our skin, to end racial profiling and police brutality, and to stop anyone from suppressing the sacred right to vote. Congressman Lewis gave me my first job. He instilled in me the conviction to fight for justice. He said to never give in, never give up, keep the faith, and keep our eyes on the prize. I'm John Ossoff. I approve this message.
Too many people struggled, suffered, and died to make it possible for every American to exercise their right to vote.
When people have no vision, they revert to division. And that's what you're seeing from my opponent right now. While she's busy calling me names, let me tell you where I stand. I believe that in the greatest nation in the world, people should have affordable health care, that Georgians who work hard every day deserve a livable wage, and that seniors ought to be able to afford the cost of prescription drugs. Kelly Loeffler may think that's radical. I think it's common sense. I'm Raphael Warnock, and I approve this message.
I'm John Ossoff. Truth is, corruption in Washington has infected both parties. They're too busy serving lobbyists to serve us. I'll ban corporate political donations and secret corporate money in politics. And I'll crack down on price gouging by health insurance and drug companies who use that money to buy off Congress. We're all in this together. Together we can end the corruption and make health care affordable. Fighting corruption is my job, and that's why I approve this message.
It didn't matter what day of the week it was, come 6 a.m., my dad would come through that door and say, "Put your shoes on, son, get ready." If I asked why, he'd say, "Because there's something for you to do. I don't know exactly what it is yet, but be ready." I'm Reverend Raphael Warnock, and I've spent my entire life trying to be ready. I grew up right here in the Caton Homes housing projects of Savannah, Georgia. I had 11 sisters and brothers. We were short on money, but long on love and faith. Our parents taught us the value of hard work. Dad was a veteran, a small businessman, and a preacher. He spent most days picking up old junk cars that others had thrown away and hauling them to the local steel yard. He saw their value. And then Sunday morning, he preached to people who themselves felt discarded. He saw value in them too. Mom grew up in Waycross, Georgia, where she spent her summers picking cotton and tobacco. But she told us that we could do anything that we put our minds to. And so, with the love of my parents and the encouragement of my community, I went to Morehouse College on a full faith scholarship. I didn't know how I would pay for it, but I graduated college, earned a PhD degree, and 14 years ago, the kid who grew up in the projects was called to Martin Luther King Jr.'s pulpit. I became the senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church.
Change still has a chance in the church that changed America.
He's senior pastor of one of the most prominent churches in America. Raphael Warnock not only preaches the gospel, but uses it as a platform for change.
Dr. King called it the drum major instinct, the urge to lead. Warnock has it and a sense of his place in this place.
Some might ask why a pastor thinks he should serve in the Senate. Well, I've committed my whole life to service and helping people realize their highest potential. I've always thought that my impact doesn't stop at the church door. That's actually where it starts. And I love this country. And I believe that what makes America so great is that we've always had a path to make it greater. Greater for people like the ones I've counseled at my church and others like them across this state. Like my father used to tell me every morning, whatever it is, be ready. And I think Georgia is ready. Ready to stand up for the family who's tried to do everything right. But when they receive one bad medical diagnosis, they realize that the cost of being sick is too much. Ready to fight for the dignity of workers who are paid too little and pushed aside as government works for Wall Street corporations. Ready because I realize that a kid who grows up in the projects today and struggling families across Georgia have it harder now than I did back then. I'm Reverend Raphael Warnock, and I'm ready. I'm ready to be your senator.
Georgia is grateful for the doctors, nurses, first responders, for those who sacrifice to keep the lights on, to keep us fed, to keep us safe, to keep us moving, for the teachers who have gone above and beyond, for the love and support of our families. Everybody in Georgia is thankful for everyone who stepped up to get us through this year. And now it's time to step up for them, to reunite our country and end this crisis. I'll work with Joe Biden to beat the virus, empowering medical experts to implement a national health strategy with free testing and vaccinations, to provide immediate financial relief for working families and small businesses, and an infrastructure and jobs program that will jumpstart our economy. And when we get this done, next year it's Thanksgiving with the whole family. To all who have given so much this year, thank you. I'm John Ossoff, and I approve this message.
We're at Mom's Kitchen in Preston, Georgia. It's a family business. I enjoy making people happy, giving them a good meal. But since COVID, we had to close our main dining room. We lost all of that business, and we used to do a lot of caterings. We can't do any of that anymore. David Perdue knew what was about to happen. He was getting classified briefings about the pandemic. But instead of him being concerned about us, he off selling stock. We had no idea we'd have to close our businesses off. We'd lose caterings, and so many people died. And then when we needed help the most, he fought against the stimulus checks and to cut unemployment insurance. Perdue needs to come out and Ossoff in. Early voting starts December 14th. You got to make a plan to vote.
I'm John Ossoff, and I approve this message.
People sometimes ask me why a pastor would decide to run for the U.S. Senate. My answer is simple. I've always felt that my impact does not stop at the church door. That's actually where it starts. And I love this country and believe that what makes America so great is that we've always had a path to make it greater. I'm Raphael Warnock, and whether you congregate in a church, synagogue, or at kitchen tables across Georgia, we can all agree that Washington could use some moral leadership. That's why I approve this message. A lot of stuff to do this time of year. Get the tree. Done. Hang the lights. Not yet. Wrap presents. Check. But this year there's one extra thing to do. Vote. That's right. Early voting starts December 14th, so make voting part of your holiday plans. It'll probably take you less time than it'll take me to do this. I'm Raphael Warnock, and I approve this message.
Raphael Warnock grew up in a house full of brothers and sisters. His parents taught him the value of hard work, like me.
Like me, he was first in his family to graduate from college and went on to earn a PhD.
He thinks insurance companies should not be allowed to discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions, like me.
Like me, Reverend Warnock knows that both parties in Washington could use some moral leadership.
I'm Raphael Warnock, and I approve this message because it's time we had a senator who put Georgians first, like me. We told them the smear ads were coming, and that's exactly what happened. You would think that Kelly Loeffler might have something good to say about herself if she really wants to represent Georgia. Instead, she's trying to scare people by taking things I've said out of context from over 25 years of being a pastor. But I think Georgians will see her ads for what they are. Don't you? I'm Raphael Warnock, and we approve this message.
Georgia, I know things are tough right now, but I want you to know help is on the way. My administration is preparing to beat COVID-19 and get economic relief to the American people. On day one as your president, I'm prepared to sign a COVID relief package that fully funds the public health response needed, led by Georgia's own CDC. It will ensure free testing and vaccination for every American, and will get small businesses the assistance they need right now. Let me be clear, I need Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff in the United States Senate to get this done. There are folks in Congress threatening to do everything in their power to block our efforts. We need you to get out there and vote for John Ossoff as well as Raphael Warnock. We need them in the Senate. God bless America, and may God protect our troops.
I'm Raphael Warnock.
And I'm John Ossoff.
And we approve this message.
have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And do we have Mr. Ossoff?
An election for the nation and the public policy that will come from this. And as it relates to COVID and the vaccine, we are in a interesting juncture as African Americans. We know also well of experiments like what took place in Tuskegee, while at the exact same time, we recognize the disproportionate impact that COVID is having on our community. And for the NAACP, and I believe for all of the African American community, we must weigh those two realities. And out of that, make sure we push forth the most relevant factual information that can be gathered at the time. In NAACP on last week, we pulled together a panel of experts who understand what's at stake, but also some of the researchers that put in place the COVID
in the production of anti-corruption investigations, investigations of organized crime, and investigations of war crimes for news organizations all over the world. And I am now locked in this very tight runoff with Senator David Perdue, and I think it's worth reflecting upon just how far we've come as a state and just how far we've come in the American South to be at this point. Georgia, the most competitive battleground in the country. 2 U.S. Senate runoffs for Senate control. The Democratic standard bearers are the young Jewish journalist, son of an immigrant mentored by John Lewis, running alongside a black preacher who holds Dr. King's pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist Church. That is the New South. That represents the multiracial, multi-generational, interfaith coalition that we've been building for so long here in Georgia. And we are fighting for health and jobs and justice for the people while we run against like the Bonnie and Clyde of self-interest and corruption and self-dealing in the U.S. Senate in Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. And I want to leave as much time as possible for Q&A, but I'll just briefly close out with this. I want everyone to reflect upon what we can achieve together when we win these 2 races. As you know, these runoffs will determine U.S. Senate control. If Mitch McConnell holds on to the Senate, he will try to do to Joe and Kamala just like he tried to do to President Obama. He will obstruct everything. He will obstruct everything. When we win these races, we can deliver on affordable health care. We can deliver on an ambitious infrastructure and jobs energy program. We can deliver on a $15 minimum wage. The next 2 years can be the most productive for civil rights and voting rights legislation since 1964 and 1965. We can pass a new Civil Rights Act. We can pass a new Voting Rights Act. But in order to do these things, we've got to win. So I want to humbly urge everybody to do everything in your power to get out the vote, because this is all about turnout. And please know I don't take your support for granted, and I'm here to answer your questions as any public servant should, so you understand what I'm fighting for and who I am. Thank you so much for the hospitality.
Absolutely, Mr. Ossoff, welcome. We're going to begin with a question surrounding COVID and health disparities for Black and Brown communities. Brother President Johnson from the NAACP is here now with a question for you, Mr. Ossoff.
Good to see you on the line. My one question is, now that there's a vaccine for COVID, what type of legislation would you propose or support to ensure we don't find ourselves in this position in the future? And what advice do you have for those who are struggling with whether or not they should take the vaccine or not?
Thank you so much, Derek. Well, first of all, I want to encourage everybody, once these vaccines are deemed to be safe and effective by our public health authorities, to get immunized. But what we have to do legislatively is ensure that everybody has access to the vaccine. We need to pass legislation to ensure free testing and vaccination for every American. Otherwise, we're at risk of seeing emerge something similar to what we saw when there was still a shortage of tests, where it's how well connected and wealthy you are that determines your access to immunization. And Vice President Biden has said he is ready to sign into law on day one legislation to ensure that the vaccine is free for every single American citizen, and to bring the kind of national coordination that's currently lacking and necessary to ensure that it is distributed effectively and swiftly across the entire country. So free testing and vaccines, we are so far from out of the woods yet. It is going to take many, many months to distribute and administer these vaccines to the level where we start to see the kind of widespread immunity necessary to slow the spread of a disease. And right now, this virus is killing more people than at any other time during this pandemic. So we can't let our guard down for a moment or take it as some indication that we've turned the corner. What we have to do now is make sure that we have the coherent and well-funded public health response to get the vaccine out there swiftly and equitably, and in a way that it is free for every citizen. And that should be led by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention here in Georgia, which has been marginalized by the Trump administration, whose experts were sidelined for months and months and months, their voices and expertise suppressed, which is one of the reasons that this virus has gotten so out of control in the United States. And then you asked about, how do we move forward? Once we beat COVID-19, which we can and we will, but again, we have a long way to go. And in many ways, the most difficult days are still ahead of us. Once we beat COVID-19, this has to be a lesson for policymakers, politicians in both political parties, but in particular within the GOP, about the perils of ignoring science and suppressing expertise. Because if the expertise of epidemiologists and infectious disease doctors had been heeded early during the outbreak in the United States, tens or hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. But the arrogance of politicians who instead pursued their short-term political interest, who suppressed the doctors and scientists who knew what they were doing, that is one of the reasons that this has taken such a terrible toll. And it's taken a particularly terrible toll upon those who don't have power or money. It's taken a particularly terrible toll on the Black community here in Georgia, and the economic impact has also been disproportionately borne by those who lack money, access, and power. People doing wage work, people in the service industry, people who are stocking shelves, people who are working in clinical settings. We have got to get economic relief to people. We've got to pass emergency hazard pay for essential workers. We got to get stimulus checks directly to families that are hurting, and immediately reauthorize small business relief, because this is an economic crisis as well as a public health crisis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think we could have ever imagined that leadership would be so important when it came to a medical crisis like that. So thank you so much for your insight and that extremely, extremely detailed answer. We're going to move on now to the topic of criminal justice reform and social justice. Brother Graham Basilis, Dr. David Marion is with us. Mr. Ossoff, with your next question.
And I want to thank Mr. Ossoff for being on the call with us tonight for this timely discussion. Mr. Ossoff, we continue to see the killing of Black men and women in this country at an alarming rate, as if there is open season on Black folks, as if Black lives don't matter. And to make matters worse, in most instances, no one is held accountable for these deaths. As Senator, what legislation would you support that would give Black folks confidence that our federal government truly cares about all of its citizens being served and protected by police?
Thank you, Dr. Marion. Well, first of all, I'll be ready on my first day of service in the U.S. Senate in just a few weeks to vote for the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which has passed the U.S. House of Representatives but is being obstructed by Republicans in the Senate. But we also have to think bigger than that. We need a new Civil Rights Act in this country, which will empower the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice to impose true accountability, where individual officers or departments or prosecutors or judges or officials in facilities of incarceration engage in racial profiling, police brutality, or where there is race or class bias systemically in the administration of justice. And that is widespread in this country. And my opponent calls these isolated incidents, but this is a systemic problem. The 14th Amendment of our Constitution is already meant to guarantee equal protection under the law. But when Ahmaud Arbery is shot to death in broad daylight on camera in the street and the local authorities look the other way because he's a young Black man, that makes a mockery of equal protection. And look, growing up as a white man in Georgia, I've never known how it feels to fear I could lose my life just because of who I am, or face false accusation of the miscarriage of justice just because of who I am. But I know that's a daily reality for Black people in America, and it has to change, and we can change it. And as I said in my opening remarks, 2021 and 2022 can be the most productive years legislatively for civil rights and voting rights since 1964 and 1965. It was the example of heroes like Lewis and Hosea Williams and Amelia Boynton and the hundreds who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Their courage, their sacrifice, their example, which paved the way for passage of the VRA in '65. And if we win these two Senate races, we can pass a new Civil Rights Act and a new Voting Rights Act. And then we will look back on the peaceful mobilization of last summer after Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery were killed as our generation's Bloody Sunday, as our generation's march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, paving the way for a new era of civil rights legislation in our country. But this is why, and I can't emphasize this enough, these races are so important and decisive and historic. The outcome here is the difference between that or nothing. If we do everything that we have to do for the next 2.5 weeks, everybody tuned in, to win these two Senate races, we can pass a new Civil Rights Act and a new Voting Rights Act. If we don't win these races, they will block criminal justice reform. They will block voting rights legislation. We will not make progress. So as you weigh the consequences, please, I'm not asking you, everybody, to get involved and work for the sake of my ambition or for the glory of a political party. I'm asking y'all to do everything that you can to get out the vote, because those are the stakes. Georgia is in a unique position right now. Georgia voters are in an extraordinary, historic position right now to make that kind of a difference, a decisive and historic difference that will determine the legislation that we can enact, that will impact quality of life and equal justice in this country for a century to come.
Yeah. Mr. Ossoff, once again, thank you so much. And if I could just kind of piggyback on your answer there with a personal story of our interaction, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate you taking the time out to listen to my personal story with the criminal justice system and our family, and then to follow up with a personal phone call after that. So, you know, when we talk about candidates being genuine and authentic, you're embodying that right now. And I wanted to just take a moment and express that to you with sincere thanks and gratitude.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it, and I hope folks know that my engagement with these issues, awareness of, and work to pursue and expand justice. This is not something I'm arriving to just now because I'm running for office. I cut my teeth working for John Lewis. He mentored me for 17 years. I worked on criminal justice issues for Congressman Johnson in the U.S. House of Representatives, authored death penalty appeals reform legislation. This is something that I care deeply about. The reason that I run a business that exposes injustice and corruption is because I'm passionate about exposing and ending injustice. And I look forward to helping to champion the kinds of civil rights legislation that we need to make a difference.
All right, let's move on to our next topic. Brother Grant Basilis has another question related to economic justice and the wealth gap. Brother Grant Basilis, are you ready for your question?
I am. I read that in the Boston area, the average net worth of a white family is $245,000, and the average net worth of a black family is $8. That to me is astounding, but it is also not accidental. As it was when we talked about health disparities, so it is that this racial wealth disparity gap is the result of systemic racist efforts to keep wealth out of the hands of black and brown people. What is it that you would do as senator to address this injustice?
Thank you for the question. And of course, economic justice and opportunity and equity in education and healthcare and housing are inextricably linked. And so I want to start by talking about investment in education. As long as the resources that are invested in a local school district reflect the wealth of that community, we will have an equitable investment and opportunity for each child. So we have got to reimagine the funding formula for public education in America so that wealthier communities do not have more resources invested in the education and opportunity available to children in those communities. That perpetuates these cycles of inequity, inequality, and poverty. Second of all, when we talk about the kinds of economic initiatives that we're going to need to pass to recover from this COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we have the opportunity now to pass the most ambitious infrastructure and jobs and recovery program in U.S. history. That's something that we can do if we win these Senate races. It is vital that every community participate equitably in that kind of investment. And what happens when you've got the kind of representatives in the Senate, because senators have significant influence over the deployment of public resources. When you've got the kinds of representatives that we do in Georgia now in the U.S. Senate, then it's those same good old patronage networks through which resources flow. And that power structure here in Georgia looks pretty similar to the power structure 50 years ago. I mean, my opponent would have been filibustering the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965 if you've been in the Senate then. So when he has influence over public investment, you can rest assured that Georgia's black community is not top of mind for him. I will bring a different approach committed to ensuring that black families and businesses and communities in Georgia receive that investment with the goal of enhancing black wealth creation, wealth generation, generational wealth over time being the goal. I also want to just take a moment and talk about the importance of increasing federal investment in HBCUs as part of this strategy for black economic empowerment. We can direct public resources to the growth of endowments at these institutions, which are vital, for example, when it comes to weathering a storm like the one that we're currently in or making long-term strategic investments. We can direct federal resources to the maintenance and construction and upgrade of facilities and technology at these institutions. One of the things I'm passionate about is expanding the Pell Grant program so that no young person in this country has to take on a penny of debt to get a 4-year degree from a public college or from an HBCU, whether that HBCU is public or private. Zero debt for attendance at any HBCUs. Think about how transformative that impact would be. For young Black Americans to be able to pursue a degree at a historically Black college or university without having to worry for a moment about the burden of debt with which they'd emerge after graduation. And finally, to invest in expanding critical field training at HBCUs, talking about education, healthcare, science, technology, engineering, to increase Black representation in those fields. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the economic priorities that I'll pursue on behalf of Black constituents in the Black community in Georgia and the U.S. Senate.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Brother President Johnson has another question for you, this time on the topic of voter suppression. We know the NAACP has always been on the forefront of this battle and continues to do so. Brother President Johnson.
Now that you've been a candidate twice and you're in the middle of a heated election, vote intimidation and vote suppression is real, and you're living through that reality now. What would you do or propose, if elected, to protect the right to vote for African Americans and so many other communities that's being targeted?
Thank you, President Johnson, and it's an honor to be here with you as well, and thank you for your service. This is why we need a new Voting Rights Act. The Shelby County v. Holder decision at the Supreme Court in 2013 struck down Section 4 of the VRA. And as you well know, what that means is that local jurisdictions and states like Georgia don't have to pre-clear changes to voting procedure with the Civil Rights Division at DOJ. Since that 2013 Shelby County v. Holder decision, we've seen the construction of this vast apparatus of voter suppression here in Georgia. Brian Kemp led a lot of that effort. And one of the reasons that they're so furious that Trump lost in Georgia and the 2 Republican senators were forced into runoffs is that they felt entitled to win in a walk and believed that apparatus of voter suppression should have entitled them to victory. They thought that they could keep the lid sealed on the pot. But the will of the people boiled over. Trump lost the state despite the intensity of voter suppression here. And now they're furious about that. And so you see what they're doing. What are David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler doing? They're hardly out campaigning. What they're doing is filing suit and attacking Republican election officials, basically for letting too many Democrats vote. And what that means is letting too many Black people vote. And all of these attacks on Georgia voters and the attempts to throw out the ballots of Georgia voters are an attack on Black voters in Georgia, because it was the extraordinary Black turnout that delivered the state for Joe Biden and forced senators into a runoff. So we need a new Voting Rights Act, which will not just fully restore the VRA of 1965, but also strengthen it so that voter suppression is a federal crime. It should be a federal crime for state or local election authorities to abuse their power to disenfranchise their own constituents on partisan or on racial grounds.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Ossoff. And we know your time is precious. We are approaching the bottom of the hour here. And before we let you go, we'd like to give you a moment to just state your case for our audience this evening. You've given us some wonderful insight on your platform, what you would do once you're elected to office. Give us your final parting words and any charges that you might have for us in terms of what we can do to help move you forward and get you over the top.
Well, I want to thank the Omegas, the NAACP, all of the convening organizations, President Johnson, Dr. Marion, you, Mark, thank you for having me. And, you know, I think we covered a lot of the ground pretty efficiently here in terms of policy and the stakes. The stakes are extraordinarily high. And so I'm asking you from the heart and directly to put in the work these next 2.5 weeks so that Reverend Warnock and I can win. These are going to be extremely close races. You know, my team and I are tracking the numbers every day. And the Reverend and I are traveling the state, and we are generating movement energy here. The turnout is record shattering for a runoff, but we also know that it's going to come down to a few thousand votes. And so victory here means landmark civil rights and voting rights legislation. Victory here means debt-free public college and HBCU tuition and a $15 minimum wage. Victory here means that when there's public investment in infrastructure, that investment flows to the Black community and not just through those old patronage networks. And if we don't win here, we don't achieve any of that, because it'll be gridlock for at least 2 years in Washington. I want to just emphasize in particular the importance of getting young people out. So to the extent you can use your influence, your networks, to help us motivate and inform young people about how to vote, that the polls are now open in Georgia to be a part of this historic moment, this historic effort, then I'd be grateful. And thank you again for the hospitality. I wish everyone good health in the holiday season.
Absolutely. Jon Ossoff, what a pleasure to have you here. We wish you the best, my friend. Good luck the rest of the way, and we'll see you at the polls.
Thank you so much. And Rev, I see you're on here. I'll see you in about a half hour.
Hey, John. Yeah, we crisscrossing all day long, every day. Good to see you, brother.
All right, you too. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Ossoff. All right, great timing here. We have Reverend Raphael Warnock here with us. And Reverend Warnock, what a pleasure to have you here. He is currently the pastor, as you know, of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, the same church of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and currently running for the seat vacated by retiring Senator Johnny Isakson and currently held by Senator Kelly Loeffler. Reverend Warnock, good evening, and thanks so much for joining us.
Good evening. Great to be with you.
Yeah, Reverend, why don't you take a moment and tell us a little bit about how you feel right now, where the campaign is headed, the energy that you're feeling. We know the numbers have been amazing this first week of early voting. How do you feel? What's the strategy look like? Bring us up to speed.
Well, I've got to tell you, I feel great. This is a historic moment. And Alpha Man is on this Zoom platform in a meeting convened by brothers of Omega Psi Phi. And so it's an absolutely historic moment. I feel great. I feel like we can solve world peace. But seriously, it's really good to see you, brothers. Derek Johnson, great to see you. Our leader of the NAACP, Mark. I always remember your time here at Fox 5. You've interviewed me many times. It's wonderful to see you, and David Marion, Sean Bland, everybody who's on this call. Thank you so much. Nothing but Pan-Hellenic love in this room.
Absolutely.
And listen, this really is a historic moment. It's a defining moment in American history. It is very difficult to overstate the importance of this election. To say, you know, we see all the time that elections have consequences, but to say that after over 300,000 Americans have perished in a matter of months. And I saw some data the other day, and I don't even want to repeat it, that suggests the numbers could be incredibly high by March or April. We have not seen times like these. The magnitude of the death that we are witnessing, I just think we ought to pause every now and then. We ought to, you know, I think part of it is we won't be able to take full stock of what we've been through until after we get through it. But this has been devastating. And it reminds us that among other things, there are a lot of lessons learned here, but one of the things is that elections are a matter of life and death. Public policy is a life and death question. Who gets to live? It doesn't have to be something as extreme as COVID. But when you decide to leave 500,000 Georgians in the Medicaid gap, as this state has chosen, we're one of only 12 states still doing that. It's a matter of life and death. People are dying because of that public policy decision. Make no mistake about it. When you decide to wage war against healthcare rather than trying to strengthen healthcare, we got 1.8 million Georgians with pre-existing conditions. That means people with asthma, people with hypertension, diabetes, stroke, folks we know, maybe even you, right? Cancer survivors, COVID survivors. Pre-existing conditions are all around us, and you may not have one today, doesn't mean you won't have one tomorrow. And so elections determine who gets healing and who stays sick, who lives, who dies, who gets to go to a good quality school, who doesn't. Will you be able to afford that education? Who gets stimulus relief in the midst of a pandemic? Can you make a livable wage? Can your children thrive and grow? Do they have a path to success? It's a matter of life and death. And so some might think it's strange that a preacher would get into a Senate race, but for me, the gospel is a matter of life and death. It's a life and death question. And so it's not a huge leap for me because, you know, I have tried to define the gospel in the way that the one in whose name I preach every Sunday defined it. Good news to the poor. Good news to the poor. The opening of the eyes of the blind, setting the captives free. Yeah. He has shown you, Micah said, O mortal, what is good and what does God require, but that you do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. And certainly that means you don't cut off your neighbor's healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. And so as I move across Georgia, Mark, to answer your question, I'm feeling a lot of energy on the ground. I started out last weekend. I was in 8 different cities over the weekend. This weekend, not as many. I spent some time in my hometown of Savannah, Georgia, and it was just brewing with energy down there. And then this morning I was in Macon in 2 worship services, the same thing. And earlier today, we were at about 3 different rallies so far, and there's just a lot of energy on the ground. People understand what's at stake. Wow. And that we have the numbers. We just need our coalition to show up. If we show up, we win.
Absolutely. We can't overstate what a pleasure it is to have you here to give us some of your time. Brother Grombosilis, David Marion has a question for you, Reverend.
I think it was, this is a good segue to this question, Reverend Warnock. And again, we're glad to have you on. As you were speaking about this, health disparities existed for Black and brown people long before COVID-19 due to systemic racism. We know that COVID-19 has only exacerbated this problem. If elected, what would you do to begin addressing this so all people can have equal access to health care?
Yes. Well, please know that I'm leading. My campaign is leading on healthcare, 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 healthcare. And you don't have to wonder about the depth of my commitment to this issue because I was talking about it long before I was running. Back in 2014, when we were trying to pass the Affordable Care Act, you know, I was preaching about it. And in 2014, when Georgia refused to expand Medicaid, you know, I in the tradition of our civil rights organizations, in the tradition of Dr. King and his dad, I went into the governor's office in an act of civil disobedience with other clergy, demanding that we expand Medicaid to the point of arrest because I thought it was that important. And I've stood up time and time again. So what I want to do, David, is translate my advocacy and agitation into legislation, my protest into public policy. We must strengthen the Affordable Care Act. We need to make sure that we force pharmaceutical companies to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs. Why would we require that for the Veterans Administration, which we should? I'm grateful that we do, but not for Medicare. Because we require pharmaceutical companies to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs with the VA, that's cut the cost for veterans for prescription drugs, as it should. We ought to do the same thing for Medicare. We need Georgia to expand Medicaid. Now, that's a state issue, but a senator can write legislation, co-sponsor legislation that will make sure that Georgia is not penalized for coming late to the party. We need legislation to further incentivize. Georgia already has every incentive to expand Medicaid. The issue is not, well, what does it cost us to expand Medicaid? It's costing us, what is it costing us not to expand Medicaid? We've had 9 hospitals to close in 10 years, mostly in our rural areas. And I've been going across rural Georgia talking about this. Their hospitals are closing, devastating their rural healthcare systems and siphoning off, you know, and devastating job creation in those areas. So we got to strengthen the Affordable Care Act. We got to be able to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs. And we ought to pass something like the public option so we cover more people. That's a start. But I believe that healthcare is a human right, and Georgia deserves a senator who believes that healthcare is a human right. Kelly Loeffler's trying to dupe people. She put together some plan that she claims covers people with pre-existing conditions. Just because you say it doesn't make it true. I mean, she's saying a whole lot of things. You don't have to take my word for it. She keeps saying a whole lot of things, especially about me, that all of the fact checkers are saying is they're calling it lies, misleading, false. And she's lying about this healthcare plan that she says covers people with pre-existing conditions. The loopholes are large enough to drive a truck through. And if you vote that way, you will have someone who will sell you a junk plan that leaves people with pre-existing conditions uncovered. I think healthcare is a human right, and I'll stand up for it time and time again.
All right, Reverend, thank you so much for that insightful answer. Reverend, this weekend I've seen video of a police officer using his department-issued SUV run down an African-American man who was unarmed in a wide open field. I've heard a Boston area police officer bragging about running into Black Lives Matter protesters with his cruiser. Police brutality against unarmed African-Americans continues. And in that regard, Brother Johnson has a question for you as we move to the area of criminal justice reform and social justice. Brother Johnson, your question?
Good to see you, Reverend. And I can recall it was 2018, the night before the election at your church. And we were there preparing for that rally. And who would have thought 2 years later we'll be preparing to turn out to vote for you. But in the midst of all of that, we've seen George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many other people. Criminal justice has long been a problem in this nation and has not always been just for Black folks. Would you support a federally funded database of police misconduct if elected to the Senate?
The answer is yes. We need to know what's going on in terms of patterns of conduct. And it's unfortunate that my opponent is trying to politicize his issue. I mean, she's sitting in a Senate seat. The good news is that there is some level of recognition in this country on both sides of the aisle that we have a problem. We've at least had a moment in the wake of George Floyd. You know, I've had friends of mine and associates come up to me and say, Rev, I will admit to you, I thought we were further along. And that Floyd incident, I thought it should have happened after Eric Garner, to be honest. He too was, lynched. Doesn't matter whether it's a knee or a chokehold, it's the same thing. You're on a Black man's neck. But something about us being holed up in our houses, I think, all of those weeks, and people couldn't look away. It was a confluence of things that actually shocked the conscience of the nation. And rather than use that moment as an opportunity to bring us together, my opponent launched a campaign against the Black women on our own basketball team to make a cheap and cynical political point. She has the privilege of doing this because she doesn't live their experience. She obviously doesn't care to know. She doesn't know what it's like to have two conversations with your kids, one about the birds and the bees, and the other about how to survive a police encounter. And to acknowledge that is not to disparage police officers and policing. It's to say that officers need to be held accountable. So I support the database. In addition to that, Derek, I think we need an independent prosecutorial review process anytime civilians die at the hands of police. I think it's an unfair burden, perhaps, to expect a prosecutor who works with the police day in and day out to solve crimes. They're that person's colleague. To leave that with them. There should be an independent process to review. And we saw what happened. We've seen over and over again when there hasn't been an indictment and the evidence. You look at it and it just, it doesn't, it flies in the face of common sense. And we need to demilitarize the police. So we build trust between police officers and community. But all of this is driven by, I think, a more fundamental, a more foundational problem that I've been talking about for years, and that's mass incarceration. The fact that the land of the free is the mass incarceration capital of the world. We're 4% of the world's population, we Americans. We warehouse 25% of the world's prisoners. We have built a massive prison industrial complex since about 1980, much of it driven by the so-called war on drugs, which has too often been a war on Black and brown communities. And I think when you have a system that massive and it is privatized, it's like having a big dog, you gotta feed it. And this thing eats Black and brown bodies, and we gotta come to terms with it. We've gotta address it honestly as a country, or otherwise, you will always see police brutality. I think this is not about the police. It really isn't. The larger public policy issue is mass incarceration. The police are just one cog in the system, and we've got to address that. And I want to take that commitment to the U.S. Senate. I think that there is some agreement, again, on both sides of the aisle that our current system is unsustainable, but we need real reform that gives all of our children a chance.
Reverend, to follow up on that point, how do we talk about taking the profit motive, the for-profit motive out of the prison industrial complex and moving it toward putting some of those education programs back in place in the system so that when individuals get out, they don't have to get on that revolving door and we can reduce the recidivism rate. Right now, there aren't enough training programs to help incarcerated individuals gain marketable skills so they're not on that treadmill and that revolving door policy. How do we even broach that conversation when the narrative seems to get hijacked, i.e. defund the police?
Well, you know, for a long time, politicians have gotten promotions through getting, quote, tough on crime. We need to be smart on crime. And I think we need to take the profit motive out of our criminal justice system. Privatize prisons set us up, I think, for the, the very issues that you're talking about. Look, this is a moment. We have an opportunity here. When the drug was crack and the bodies were Black and brown in the 80s and the 90s, we had a war. We had a war on drugs. And now that the drug is opioids and the bodies are white, in rural and suburban areas, we recognize that we're dealing with a health issue, a health emergency. I think that's right. The contrast is jarring for me as someone who's seen what has happened to other communities. Is jarring, but rather than us getting angry about it, I think here is an opportunity to build a multiracial coalition of conscience devoted to building a more just and equitable system. I'm the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. served. I've spent my career trying to bring people together rather than divide them, and know that you have my absolute commitment to try to bring people together, because there's a lot of pain in those rural communities where I've been visiting. And those hospitals are closing and they're devastated. They're also devastated by the opioid crisis. And they've seen the death that it has visited upon their children and all that attends to that. Here's an opportunity to bring together people whom the politics have tried to divide by the subtext of race and kind of nativistic preoccupations that focus, on that ugly side of our complicated history as an American nation, and help us to see the ways in which we're connected, and that too many of our children are self-medicating over against the despair and hopelessness that they're fighting against in a post-industrial nation that has seen an increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots. The wealthy and the well-connected have all the representation they could ever want in Congress, while real wages for ordinary people have steadily gone down for decades. We can build a movement on that brings us together, that creates the kind of opportunity that all of us want for our children.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on now to a topic you just kind of broached there, economic justice and the wealth gap. Let's go back to Brother Graham Basilis, Dr. David Marion, with a question for you.
Thank you, Mark. Reverend Warnock, as you know, African Americans are being disproportionately affected as it relates to higher unemployment, higher numbers of their small businesses that are closed and won't return because of this pandemic. It is so important now more than ever to support these businesses and also to retrain and reskill African Americans to ensure that our community is a part of the wealth generation of the digital tech revolution we're experiencing. My question is, how could the federal government partner with HBCUs and big tech companies to train young African American students in the area of technology so that they can create entrepreneurial opportunities for themselves and be trained and prepared for tech job opportunities, especially since big tech says it wants a more diverse workforce?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the spirit of what we need to do is already in your question. And so part of what I want to say to you, David, is amen. And let's, we need to make that happen. As you know, I'm a graduate of an HBCU, Morehouse College. I spent my summers, even as a high school student, in a program, a great federal program called Upward Bound, which got students who would be the first generation in their family to go to college. I'm an Upward Bounder, which is a part of TRIO. I know what good federal public policy does. You're looking at a graduate of Upward Bound, and even before that, you're looking at a graduate of Head Start, another great federal program, reduces the word gap for poor kids, that enrichment of the brain that we all need between 0 and 4. The sad news for all of us on this call, and it's a brilliant brothers, brilliant folk on this call. The sad news that I have to deliver to you is you will never, ever, ever be as smart as you were between 0 and 4. It all went downhill after that. The capacity, when those neurons were firing at a rate at which they'll never fire again, you wouldn't want them to fire that fast anymore. You would something would happen to you. But we have so we actually do have to start at that level. Because we need a pipeline that leads to these HBCUs, that leads to these community colleges. And a lot of times our HBCUs are having, and that has been part of their historic task, and God bless them for it. They have to do a lot of remediation. They polish up diamonds in the rough in a way that nobody else seems to be able to do it. And they deliver some of the most productive citizens this country has seen. But a lot of our kids arrive and they're not ready because they've been in a system that hasn't prepared them. They've been dealing with the inequality in our educational system before they get to that level. So we need to address that pipeline. Early childhood development needs to be part of the investment in infrastructure that we need in this country. And then we need equity in education. But then then absolutely, yes, we need HBCUs have been punching above their weight for decades, and they deserve the kind of investment. Imagine if they actually had the resources, given what they've been able to do without anything. Imagine if they actually had some real resources. Most of our HBCUs, are tuition driven. I went to Morehouse kids. They're tuition driven. They don't have that much of a margin, which is why when we went through the Great Recession, And now we're going through this. A lot of HBCUs are just barely hanging on. It is enlightened self-interest for us as a country to invest in these schools. And I, as an HBCU grad, will be there pushing for it in the Senate. And if we need to, we can get it. If we can get it to 50-50 after Jon Ossoff and I win these seats, we can break the tie with another HBCU graduate, Kamala Harris, a graduate of Howard University. These schools have been contributing so much, but we also need to contribute. We need partnerships with our community colleges and our technical colleges. Not everybody goes to a 4-year institution. Not everybody needs to. But coding and other ways of participating in technology don't necessarily require a college degree. Mark Zuckerberg went to Harvard. He's not a graduate. And so we need a pipeline that gets kids ready, even before they get to the 4-year schools, and also in technical and vocational schools.
All right. And before we let you get out of here, Reverend, Brother President Derrick Johnson has one more question related to voter suppression for you. We know that's an issue here in Georgia especially, but also around the country.
So considering what you know in this election and past elections, what would you tell a voter who shows up to the poll and for whatever reason they're unable to cast a ballot or being told they cannot cast a ballot? What would you instruct that voter to do?
They should reach out to one of our various organizations that provide voter suppression. They can reach out to your own organization, reach out to the NAACP. We have Fair Fight on the ground here in Georgia. And I don't want to give the wrong information. Maybe you all have the number, but their voter protection is going on. It's right here on the ground. The good news is, if somebody tells you you got to vote provisionally or something like that, it can be addressed immediately. You don't have to wait and see until, and it can be addressed in real time in many cases. So actually, arm yourself with that information. And what you can do in the meantime is go to votewarnock.com. If you go to my website at that place, votewarnock.com, there's information that will help you, first of all, verify that you're registered. So you should go through the process of verification before you go to the polls, because Georgia is a state that has, among other things, purged voters from the voter rolls. And under the this notion when you didn't vote, you didn't use it, you lose, all these crazy things we've been doing in this state. They purged 500,000 voters one Saturday night in this state. So go to votewarnock.com or go to sos.ga.gov, SOS, the Secretary of State, sos.ga.gov to check and make sure you're registered, especially if you haven't voted. If you didn't vote on November 3rd, just make sure you're registered. And if you vote by mail and there's an issue, something that's not quite right on your ballot, because we've been taking them to court and forcing the issue, they have to notify you. And you have an opportunity to do what's called curing your ballot. You have a period of time to cure your ballot so that your vote counts. So there's absolutely ways to address this thing, but the biggest thing I want to say to folks is this. The best thing we can do to fight voter suppression is to turn out. Turn out. Voter suppression, it's like, I don't know if there are any dentists on the call. It's not something you cure. Your dental work is something you maintain. You're right through regular dental treatments. It'll always be voter suppression. We'll have to always push back in this way or that way. But the real answer to voter suppression, particularly given what's going on in this state, is show up. And because we have been registering voters at such a record that the systems of suppression that they put in place, they were overcome by the voices and the energy of the people. The energy of the people. That's why the senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, called over here to the Republican Secretary of State, said, how can you let that happen? I mean, if you think about it, if he called over here, what is he telling you? He's telling you, wait a minute, we have things in place. It's not supposed to happen this way. We know how to fix this. But the problem is Stacey Abrams lost by less than 55,000 votes out of 4 million cast in 2018, 1.4%. We've registered 800,000 new voters in Georgia since then. So we've been registering voters and educating voters and mobilizing voters at a faster clip than they can suppress us. And if we stand up during early voting and on January 5th, but don't wait till January 5th. There's no such thing as election day, it's election season. If we stand up now like we did during the general, they can't stop us. We will absolutely seal the deal. You'll send Jon Ossoff to the Senate. You'll send Raphael Warnock to the Senate, and we will win the future for all of our children.
Reverend Raphael Warnock, thank you so much for the inspiring words. We know you have a tight schedule. We thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We wish you Godspeed and we wish you the very best as we continue through election season, head to the ballots nice and early to get our ballots cast. And on January 5th, we hope to be celebrating right along with you. So
grateful to be here with my brothers. After all, Jesus said, I am Alpha and Omega. Let's turn around together, brothers. And, to my Kappa brothers, the blood was red and Sigma's everybody. We love everybody. Let's make this happen. All right? Yes, sir.
It's all Pan-Hellenic love. Yes, indeed. Reverend Raphael Warnock, thank you so much for being here with us. We certainly appreciate you, my friend. Best of luck.
Blessings.
Absolutely. And we want to thank you, our audience, for joining us this evening. It's been a lively, productive hour. What a wonderful discussion we've been able to have with our two candidates in the Georgia Senate runoff. And before we wrap our broadcast, we'd like to give Brother President Derrick Johnson a moment to just give us some final parting thoughts, if you would, on what your takeaway was from tonight's candidates, taking the time out, to address our audience and our concerns.
The biggest takeaway is that neither one of them take our vote for granted. And I think Reverend Warnock's last statements, in order to overcome vote suppression, we must overwhelm the system with votes. And that's the key thing we must do as Omegas. That's the key thing we must do as African Americans to ensure that democracy works for everyone and equal protection under the law is provided to our people and for our legacy.
All right, let's go to Brother Graham Basilis, Dr. David Marion. Brother Graham Basilis, your parting thoughts?
Yeah, I thought Derrick summed it up. I think it's clear that elections have consequences. We're trying to have a different set of consequences on January 5th. And so these two candidates, I think, spoke to the issues of African Americans in terms of the subject matter that we talked about tonight. I think their responses were on point. Omegas and all of the Divine Nine are excited about the success of our efforts to get out the vote on November 3rd. We're going to continue to work hard to get out the vote on January 5th. The Omega Network for Action is also coming up strong in these particular situations. We're excited. We're going to continue to push and push hard.
Absolutely. All right, gentlemen, thank you for your time this evening and your insightful and thoughtful questions. It certainly has been a pleasure to work with you this evening. Thanks again. And for you folks out there watching at home on the live broadcast, we thank you for joining us as the Omega Network for Action continues to try to uplift those underserved communities by providing you with the information you need to be an informed electorate as you head to the polls. Remember, when we all vote, change happens. That's it for us tonight. Have a great evening. We'll see you at the polls.